Good afternoon, folks. We might get this this important seminar, webinar on the road. My name is Dave Sweeney, and I'm very happy to be emceeing today's event. I'm talking to you from Bunurong country in Milau, over on the south coast of Victoria. And this is like all of this country. This is a nation that sovereignty was never ceded, and there is profound unfinished business, but there is on Upurli Upurli land, on lands right across WA and right across wherever people might be watching this. So I wanted to acknowledge and show respect to elders past, present, emerging, and also to really note that in relation to nuclear issues, there's a particular disproportionate and adverse burden on First Nations people from this industry, whether it's weapons testing, uranium mining, radioactive waste proposals. It invariably happens on First Nations land and often without their consent. So it's really appropriate in this discussion to acknowledge that, and I'd really welcome also the presence tonight of Maria Barton joining us, and if there's any other First Nation people engaged or watching tonight, special shout out to you as well. Just a little bit of housekeeping. There is this is being recorded, and that's to enable for it to be a resource and to enable people who aren't able to join in this time to be able to access that. But if anyone has any problem about that, like a confidentiality issue or that, possibly just keep your camera off is the easiest way. We will have time today for a good discussion and for questions and comments and that can be placed in the chat or the question and answer, the Q&A function, as the meeting goes on. But don't worry, we will get that chance, absolutely. Now, look, I suppose I wanted to start today by acknowledging that while our focus today is understandably and properly on WA, I wanted to start a bit further away because it is extremely disturbing and distressing images coming out of the Ukraine, and the sense of fragility, the sense of the potential for a rapid escalation in nuclear threat from that conflict is a real concern to many people. And I know a lot of people on this call have spent a lot of time highlighting concerns and threats and security and safety concerns and threats of nuclear. And there is absolutely no joy in being proved correct. I just wanted to note a couple of things in the Ukraine, and what we've seen is that waste facilities and reactors have been seen as legitimate targets, or at least legitimate, not legitimate reasons to stop fighting. We've got a situation where the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency has said that this is unprecedented because it's the first war that has been fought in and around civilian nuclear facilities. As the slide shows there's been attacks on waste storage facilities, and as people would know, two of the largest reactor complexes, including the now infamous Chernobyl site, have lost effective regulatory control. There are real concerns about that, the well-being of people and staff, local communities, but real concerns about the security of some of the key pieces of infrastructure, the power and water that's needed 24/7 to keep fuel or spent fuel or reactor cores cool. If that gets interrupted by design or as an unintended consequence of a military action, that is a deeply disturbing situation. I've already seen Chernobyl once, and there's no desire to see it again. I think what this shows too is the highly weaponized nature of nuclear. Some people refer to nuclear reactors as pre-deployed targets or pre-deployed terrorist targets, because you have then hardwired literally into your state, you've got a massive vulnerability. And I'm not being flippant, but no one is biting their nails and staying awake at night, hoping the Russian troops are acting responsibly at the wind farm. What this shows utterly is that nuclear is the most weaponizable aspect of an energy source. And as we're building an energy source, we need to build an energy source that's secure and safe and sustainable. There's also, apart from the big picture of nuclear as high risk and a range of really complicated security considerations, there's a direct Australian connection to the situation in Ukraine, which I just wanted to touch on too. And 5 years ago, Australia embarked on a plan to sell uranium to Ukraine. There were very many voices, civil society voices, academics, diplomats and others who expressed real concerns because of the governance deficiencies in the Ukrainian nuclear sector and because already Russian-backed separatists had attacked facilities in the Ukraine, nuclear facilities. There'd been armed incursions. So a lot of people said we shouldn't be doing this. It went before a committee called JSCOT, the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties, and they took those concerns seriously and they said to the government that this sales deal shouldn't go ahead unless the government can develop and maintain an extraction plan for Australian uranium should things go wrong or should there be a loss of regulatory control. Now, last Friday was the anniversary of Fukushima, and it was confirmed that Australian uranium was in Fukushima when that reactor complex melted down. So when you hear direct release into the Pacific or Fukushima fallout, that started in a uranium mine in Australia. We know that for a fact, confirmed by the Australian Safeguards and Non-Proliferation Office. We also know for a fact that in April 2021, an Australian shipment, first one to date, of uranium went to Ukraine, and it has now effectively gone off the radar. So we're seeing a situation where the conflict, the biggest threat posed by the conflict is an uncontrolled radiation release, either from failed facilities, either from a nuclear weapon, or either from missing and off the radar nuclear materials. So there's some salutary lessons here, and it really shows that we need checks and balances, not paper promises. And it really, really highlights how significant our work is. And the final thing I just wanted to share on the Ukraine story was a comment that was driven by First Nations people from WA and then picked up to become a national position from the Australian Nuclear Free Alliance. And it's a statement that basically says that we understand that these facilities can be used to threaten and intimidate a community and people. It shows solidarity and our hearts go out to people. But there's that pivotal third paragraph which says, we do not want our country being used in weapons to destroy other people's country and lives. We do not want a mineral from our country fueling reactors and waste facilities that can be weaponized against civilians in war. We send our support to Ukraine and stand in solidarity with people worldwide for a safe, nuclear-free and peaceful future. And I just think there's a depth of compassion, long-term vision, leadership and decency there that's missing in a lot of public life. And I really give an acknowledgement to those crew. And I think that sense of we don't want a mineral from our country fueling increased risk is a really powerful lesson to take home, to frame and to start this discussion. So, you know, thanks so much to people who have been doing that work, drafting that work and keeping this uranium in the ground. So look, from Ukraine to WA, and CCWA, the Conservation Council of WA, has led the NGO and the civil society efforts to constrain the uranium mining push in WA. And I really want to credit current and former staff and funders and facilitators, particularly big shout out to KA, Garlic and to Mia Pepper and to Piers Verstegen for like long, hard work at this, but ably supported by ANWA, by BUMP, by FANG, by the Quakers. There's so many different branches of this ecosystem that's kept WA nuclear free. Massive, massive achievement in Australia's largest resource state to hold the uranium mining industry. And the rest of Australia owes a credit to activists and advocates in WA for that. So now the Con Council wants to move from defensive positioning to take the challenge and the request and the expectation up to the McGowan government to not just close the door to the uranium industry in WA, but to weld that door shut. And look, along with staff and everyone else, it's the president, the board, the people who play those often unsung roles in a civil society group deserve that recognition as well, because there's a boldness and a bravery, whether it's to go against a legal action against Uliri or whether it's to support staff through lean years. Just CCWA's consistent presence in advocacy in this work has been very powerful and enormously effective. And gives me great pleasure to welcome now the former WA Premier, the current CCWA President, and a person who is very well placed to share some of the WA uranium story with us tonight, and that's Professor Carmen Lawrence. Hello, Carmen.
Hi, Dave, and hello to everyone. It's a great privilege indeed to be here talking to you, given, as Dave said, there's been an enormous amount of work by good people through the Conservation Council, working with Indigenous West Australians to ensure that we keep the whole question of uranium mining in particular at the forefront of people's minds in this state. I'm speaking to you from Whadjuk Noongar country, and I have a great privilege in doing that. And as I said, Indigenous people have been absolutely critical, First Nations people critical to this struggle, and we'll hear a little more about that later. But I just wanted to take you through a brief history. Forgive me if some bits of it might be slightly inaccurate. I've done my best to research the material that's available and to, in a sense, place uranium in Australia in a historical context, so we can see some of the struggles that Dave's mentioned, highlighted by decisions that have been made by governments, both state and federal. Now, obviously, if you look around the world, including in Australia, there was a lot of post-war enthusiasm for nuclear weapons, some of it born out of fear, some of it born out of the effects that it had, particularly in Japan. And there was also enthusiasm for nuclear power generated by some of the same people, spinning in many cases a story that has not really been realized yet. You know, the idea that you would have cheap nuclear power, that it was without consequences, there weren't environmental problems, and so on and so on. Those lies were perpetrated knowingly by some of the people who allowed these stories to go out into the wider community. But nonetheless, Australian governments of all stripes and jurisdictions in the late 40s and 50s particularly were enthusiasts for nuclear energy and for allowing weapons testing in Australia, including off the coast of Western Australia. And as Dave has also indicated, the impact on the people in Maralinga, for example, were catastrophic and not recognised for many, many decades. People were driven off their land, they were injured, they were made ill, and they had no compensation at all for that. So there were some very wicked consequences of that initial embrace of nuclear testing. It was embraced with a kind of naive servant of the empire enthusiasm. If you look at some of the images, the Brits were clearly on top of things and thought the Australians were idiots for allowing them to do what they were doing. And we are still living with the consequences of that as a society. If you look at the time in the newspaper accounts in the 50s in particular, there were huge numbers of successes, in inverted commas, in finding uranium deposits around Australia, including in Western Australia. I looked up the West Australian archives, and about every second edition, someone had found another site where there was uranium that might be suitable for exploitation. And there was a commencement during that time of uranium mines in Australia. And at that time, the major political parties, including in Western Australia, supported uranium mining, indeed were encouraging it. They supported the processing of uranium in Australia, although that hasn't ever really happened. They were enthusiastic about the possibility of nuclear power generation, and they weren't averse to the use of nuclear weapons either. You know, they were, generally speaking, on board with all of those elements of the nuclear industry. But as many of you would know, because some of you were around at the time, perhaps not so much in the late 70s, but into the 80s, we saw a gradual shift in the politics, particularly around the anti-nuclear weapons movement. But peace activism was one of the driving forces, and the anti-nuclear movement was growing worldwide, including in Australia. And there was an increasing concern too about environmental consequences and the effects on human health. Some of the work coming out of Japan in particular, immediately after the war, it's very clear. I mean, the huge loss of life there, but also the consequences of exposure to radiation in the longer term were the subject of more careful scientific analysis. There was union activism too against occupational health risks associated with mining, and a lot of the unions at the time were driving the movement against the exploitation of uranium in Australia. And Indigenous opposition was strong too, right from the outset. And it was running up against land rights requests and demands in the Northern Territory in particular. And as a result, perhaps, of all of these pressures, the Labor Party platform eventually adopted opposition to uranium mining and processing in the late 70s. And that really spread all around the country because of the way it was framed. In Western Australia at the same time, there was considerable enthusiasm, particularly by then Premier Court in the 70s, for uranium mining and processing. And indeed, at one point, he nominated sites for nuclear power stations north of Perth, at least 2 of them. And he was encouraging Western mining through their lease at Yeelirrie to exploit it, and also to engage in processing at that site. Now, I suppose one of the things that's worth remembering about Western Australia is that we're sometimes seen as, you know, a backwater, a nation unto ourselves, not necessarily driving policy nationally. But this is one case really where I think that did happen and has continued to happen. That move by Court in particular, and the peace movement here, saw the campaign against nuclear energy developed. You know, you would all be familiar with CANE. It had a huge impact around the country and around the world. And of course, the campaign for nuclear disarmament and the establishment of a party here. And again, some of you may well have been members of those groups. So this momentum, you know, led to demonstrations and street walks and a lot of activism. So West Australians, I think, became much more aware of what was happening in their state. By the time Charles Court lost government, or Ray O'Connor did to be exact, and Brian Burke succeeded, the ALP nationally had changed its policy somewhat, but there was still a 3 mines policy. So there were to be no more new mines opened up in Australia. So that meant that whatever the disposition of West Australian premiers, they were caught by that proposition. And during Burke's time, although some people suggested he was a bit keen on nuclear exploitation, it didn't happen. I don't know whether that's fair or not, but there have been suggestions in some of the media commentary. But some things never change. In my research, what I found, I had forgotten this or perhaps never known it. A newspaper report in 1986, the French company Total Mining, Dave probably knows this, recommenced mining at their Maninji mine, that's near Onslow, operating under the guise, it was said, this is the West Australian saying this, the guise of a trial to circumvent the ban on new uranium mines, and also the ban on the French receiving any of our uranium because of their nuclear testing in the Pacific. They were busily exporting in the previous year 24 tons of uranium, and they were doing it by hiding it among empty caustic soda drums in contravention of the Code of Practice for Transport of Radioactive Materials. And they'd obviously been using caustic soda for solution mining, which was banned even at that time in some places because it was so environmentally destructive, remembering that this place near Onslow is on the Ashburton River. So again, the impacts on local Indigenous people would have been considerable. So that was happening even, when there was a ban on mining in Western Australia. And so that sort of trickery, unfortunately, has characterised the industry here for a long time. When I became Premier, in my first major speech, I reiterated the ban on uranium mining. The court government, which followed when we lost government, was sympathetic, but there was little investor interest even after Howard was elected and did away with the 3 mines policy. There were lots of national inquiries and the like, but really nothing much happened here. And then the Gallop governments and the Carpenter governments reinstated and retained the ban. When Barnett was elected, he was pretty enthusiastic, but again, market conditions didn't really encourage much in the way of serious exploration, though they did rush through these 4 legacy leases, if you like, mines that we're now having to deal with, right at the death knock, knowing that they were about to lose the election. And although the ALP policy and McGowan government were very clear about reinstating the ban, unfortunately, their nervousness about potential compensation for those 4, at least that's the polite interpretation, I'll stick with that, meant that they didn't immediately revoke those existing approvals. And the result is that we now have one continuing with the most bizarre approvals being given on the grounds that they had actually started their operation before the deadline had expired. I know others are going to talk about that, so I won't go into that in detail. But as you can see, it's been a sort of a twisted path, but West Australia, as Dave said, has kind of held its own through all of this. And we know that the failure to do so would have very dramatic consequences in terms of the health, the security risks, the environmental consequences, and the moral consequences of investing in what is a weapons grade material for the most part. And I might just say in conclusion that I found some material a little while ago showing that the stillbirth rates were double and the cancer rates 50% higher amongst the Mirarr people who lived adjacent to the Ranger uranium mine. Now, no one's prepared to attribute it to the fact that they live near the mine, but there's no other explanation that passes muster. So there's that to concern ourselves with, and I know that many people are worried about those health effects wherever we see the exploitation of nuclear material. I hope I haven't taken too long. I forgot to look at my watch. Apologies, Dave, if I have.
No apology needed, Carmen. That was really succinct and clear and great. And thanks, for reminding us too about WA's role in driving so much of the national nuclear-free positioning, and it's very much a case of we're here standing now on the shoulders of giants, and WA has done some amazing things, including, electing Joe Valentine as the Senator for Nuclear Disarmament, which was unprecedented and powerful. And there's been long work for a long time. And I noticed in the chat, people are saying, I cannot believe that we're here, it's 2022 and we're here talking, subs, uranium mines, nuclear reactors, all that sort of stuff. And I agree, I share that sense of, come on, can we please move on? But I suppose my comment to folks is that we are fighting this today because we won it yesterday. And if we win it again today, then maybe it will actually, not be coming up to be another fight tomorrow. But we shouldn't, we can get tired, but we shouldn't slump our shoulders. And because we have, and in WA in particular, you put up a fantastic shield wall against this industry. So thanks, Carmen, very much. And look, uranium mining has very significant impacts and risk pathways, and it brings an added level of concern over its possible impacts on country and on community. Many First Nations people are very concerned about or opposed to the Vimy mine plan. Many have a very sharp sense of the impacts of the wider nuclear industry, with people in that area having been earlier displaced by the Maralinga A-bomb tests. And Maria Barton is a Upurli Upurli Nguratja woman, and she's a member of the Upurli Upurli native title claimants for the area around Vimy's proposed mine. And we're really lucky to have the chance to hear from Maria tonight and to hear about her community's concerns, or just get a sense of how people feel about that idea and that country. So welcome to this conversation, Maria.
Maria, you've got to unmute. Sorry.
Hello, everyone. Maria from the Upurli Nguratja claim. Very lucky to be speaking today. I'm only one of a big group on our claim group, and there's a lot of people that could be talking today, but I've got the good opportunity. I'm talking from Derby, home of the Nguratja and the Bunaba people, so great country up here too. But with us, our main concerns is the mine, the Vimy mine, the Mulga Rock mine is on the top of the Queen Victoria Springs Nature Reserve, which is in our area of our home. It's been in our family for years. From the time we've been here, our family have lived there all their lives. They've practiced, they've lived off the earth, they've lived off the land. They've been born there, they've died there, and since we've got more vehicle access and things like that, we've been able to go out there and sleep and practice our cultures and everything like that. Sadly, my father's people were from Maralinga, and the Maralinga bombing happened, so we know exactly what the nuclear and the waste stuff can do to our land and our country. I wasn't even born when Maralinga happened, and I've been lucky enough to go back over there over 20 years ago. The cleanup is absolutely shocking. It takes a long time. So with this uranium mining that's happening up the top of our country, it's horrific. We don't want it. We haven't been notified by anything that was happening. The only contact we've had is what we see on internet, and we've seen mine sites being built, runways being built, and we've had no contact with the Vimy resources at all. This is our country, our land, and we have family that still live out in the bush, that still live not too far from there, that still go out and access these areas. The main thing is, like, a lot of us are now grandparents, and I never had the opportunity to grow up in my dad's country of Maryland, or we don't even have the opportunity to go there now because of the, of the site that's been ruined. We don't want that for our own children. We don't want that for our next generations to happen. It's all good and well to say that uranium mining is going to bring a lot of money into the country, but it's going to be devastating. There's long-term effects. The water's going to go missing. The land's going to be cleared. The animals are going to go. Our people won't be able to go out there and practice their law or their cultures anymore. We won't be able to teach our children anything out there. It's going to be all lost again. They even in the long run, when they say, oh, a couple of generations, they're going to take our water. They're going to take everything. It's going to ruin everything. And we need to keep it safe for our children. The thing that's happening over in Ukraine is just another example of what could happen to us. We don't think it's going to happen, but it can happen. And we just don't want to be accountable to take, stuff from our country to make it worse for other countries. We all want to live in peace. We all want to live in harmony, and we just want to be left alone and have our own country to ourselves. And that's it.
And that's plenty. That's fantastic, Maria. Thank you. That was really crisp, clear, and powerful, Maria Barton. Thanks very much for that, for joining us tonight, for sharing that. And it's just still extraordinary, really. Again, 2022, and you can have a highly contested, as Carmen said, highly irregularly approved uranium project going on with no contact, no discussion, no consent, not even an information session with traditional owners and native title claimants. It's quite an extraordinary state of affairs. Thanks for joining us and sharing that, Maria. And if you could pass on back to family and crew that there are very many people around the country, particularly around WA, but right around the country, who are keeping a very close eye on Vimy and do not want that project to go ahead. Also, just one diary date that came up, Maria spoke about the impact of the displacement from Maralinga, and that's continuing trauma and damage to communities and to country. And this October, the 3rd of October, in WA, it's the 70th anniversary of the first British nuclear test. where they bombed that Montebello Island. And so, you know, that's a good time to regroup and think about what we can do to highlight the human cost of this trade. We were going to hear from Maggie Wood, the director of Cons, but as is the way in these uncertain times, her plans had to change at short notice, and she sends her apologies. She's not able to join us tonight. But Mia Pepper is. She's CCWA's nuclear-free campaigner. She's a tenacious tracker of drill rigs and dodgy dollar flows. And she's done a power of work on this issue. She's ideally placed to give us an insight into CCWA's thinking and the way forward from here to keep the uranium trade out of WA. So thanks, Mia.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Carmen and Maria. So good to hear from you both about that history and that perspective and where we've got to now. It's such a long history, and like others have said, we're standing on shoulders of giants, and we're really pleased to be standing side by side now for this fight ahead of us. I'm calling in from Wajak Buja. I'm really lucky and fortunate to be in this beautiful part of the world fighting on this issue. So I've just got a couple of slides that I wanted to talk through a little bit about where things are up to at the moment with the 4 uranium projects that were approved under the Barnett government and where we're going to from here. So three out of the 4, Kintyre, Yeelirrie and Wiluna, those approvals had 5 years. They had to substantially commence mining within 5 years. That was a condition of their approval, and they all failed to do it. And what's even more interesting is that they didn't even try to commence uranium mining in that period. And I think that's important when we look at Mulga Rock in a bit more detail, that the economics of this industry and the uncertainty around this industry, and also the resistance that this industry has been met with in WA, I think has been big contributing factors to why they haven't advanced those 3 projects. So now that gives us some really good opportunities to prevent mining in those 3 areas. And at each of those 3 sites, there has been sustained and strong community resistance. I think last year it was, there was a new section of the Environmental Protection Act in WA that came into power, and that's section 47A, which gives the minister the ability to withdraw approvals if they fail to meet that commencement condition, like these 3 projects have. So none of these projects met that commencement condition, and it now means that the minister has this power to withdraw those applications, those approvals. And I think the important thing to know is that while they've expired, it would only take an amendment to a condition for those projects to get up and running again. So in some future scenario that there's a Liberal government, not that it seems possible anymore, but it is, we have to think forward about the potential for any of those companies to apply to the minister to try to amend a condition, and they could be up and running again. In fact, Cameco at the Yeelirrie site has put in a request to Minister Whitby saying, we want to extend our approval, and the minister's now considering that, and we're strongly urging him not to extend the approval for Yeelirrie. And beyond that, we're asking that he withdraw the Yeelirrie approval, the Kintyre approval and the Wiluna approval. So that's really critical for those 3 projects, and really urge you, if you have the means and capacity to reach out to the minister's office, that it would go a long way to echo those calls. And he's actively considering it at the moment. So in this process of looking at this condition for these mines, we had to start asking what is substantial commencement. And what I think is really interesting here is that it's deliberately vague. So there is no definition of what substantial commencement is in the Environmental Protection Act. And when we spoke to the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation about it, they said, we leave it deliberately vague so that the companies don't just do what we say they have to do to meet this requirement. So at Kintyre, Yeelirrie and Wiluna, they didn't even try to meet substantial commencement. So we're not sure really what it looks like for those projects. At Mulga Rock, they did try. And so we're kind of in this position now where we argued really strongly that the things that they did at the site don't constitute as substantial commencement. They were destructive and they were dangerous, they were reckless, but they weren't substantial. And that's an argument we're having at the moment. And we're having that argument because the government decided that they had reached substantial commencement. So what's destructive but not substantial? They have cleared land, they've laid some pipes, they've started stockpiling some overburden. But yeah, when we look at the scale of what they intend to do, we've been arguing that they've spent less than 7% of the costs to actually establish a project. They've cleared less than 6% of the total area that they need to clear. So we think that it's destructive, but not substantial. And the biggest thing here that we think that the government should have looked at is whether or not the company actually intend to mine. And at this point, they haven't made that decision. They haven't got a bankable feasibility study. They haven't got final approval. They still need a works approval from the Department of Water. They still need export licenses, licenses to possess nuclear material, license to construct a nuclear facility, which is a processing plant to process the ore. So there's a whole suite of stuff that they don't have. But most importantly, they don't have the funding to establish the mine. The capital costs to start this mine are well over 200 million, and they've just raised 17 million. And they haven't raised $17 million to start a mine. They've raised $17 million to do a bankable feasibility study. And then kind of the next important thing to understand about Vimy Resources is that we really don't think that they intend to mine because they've started a strategic review process where they're looking at what are the best possible options to return value to their shareholders, and that might actually be to sell it or sell off parts of it. So we're fighting against this uranium mine that this company isn't really committed to building just yet because they don't have the funding, but they are trying to, sell it or create some value for their shareholders. So this gives us a pretty good opportunity to lobby and campaign around the company and the sale of the project. So some of the key things that we're doing at the moment is exposing the poor economics, making arguments about the market, about nuclear power and uncertainty, the risks, the dangers. We've been engaging with shareholders and potential buyers, and particularly over some of the issues that Maria was talking about. Not only is this company, trying to mine uranium, but they're doing it in some of the worst possible ways. Some corporate behaviour that we had hoped would be long behind us in Australia. But these companies spent the best part of a decade denying that traditional owners had any interests in that area. And now that there is a registered native title claim group, which Maria is part of, they haven't even yet met with them or acknowledged the importance of that claim over that area. So we're really concerned about this company and any potential future buyer and how they choose to engage with people on the ground. Some of the other things we're doing, we're tracking the company's every move, making sure that they're compliant with every condition that they need to be compliant with, and looking for any avenue really to contest and oppose this project. And we're calling on the government to require 100% mine closure bond, because what's worse than a uranium mine is an uneconomic uranium mine that gets started and then fails to close properly. And so the last thing we want is a uranium mine at all, but a uranium mine that starts and closes and leaves a huge mess behind. We've done a few very rough back of the envelope numbers on what closure costs might be for this project. And we think it would be in the ballpark of 500 million. And we know the Ranger uranium mine, which closed in January last year, they kept recalculating the costs of closure there. And this year it was exposed that they're now estimating closure costs at $1.2 to $2.2 billion. You know, it was a big mine, and it operated in a really sensitive area, completely surrounded by a national park in a wetland. It was quite different, but the issues are still the same, and rehabilitating not only radioactive material, but potentially acid forming material, which can create an environmental problem called acid metalliferous drainage. They're two issues that are very real at Mulga Rock, and we're really concerned about. So one thing that we're calling for is 100% closure bond up front. And then the other thing that we're doing on, which I've already spoken about, but I think it's really important to reiterate, is that we're calling on the WA Labor government to withdraw the approvals for those 3 mines. Labor, as we heard, have a strong policy position at the party level opposing uranium mining, and they voted on that again in 2019 to reaffirm their anti-uranium mining position. They also passed a motion in 2019 saying that they were going to adopt, that they would regulate this and scrutinize this at the highest level, noting that it was different to other minerals. And we're yet to see that play out with Mulga Rock, because I think people have underestimated or undermined the intention of the company to advance, but they've cleared land, they're stockpiling overburden. And at this point, we're now really concerned, and we're not seeing that level of regulation that we would expect. And we're definitely not seeing the level of transparency that we expect from this government on this industry. So what can you do? There's heaps actually that at this point you can do, and we're really looking for your support. Next Wednesday, there's a protest or creative action really at VIMI's office on St. George's Terrace. And if you are able to, after this webinar finishes, KA Garlic, who many of you will know, who's a nuclear free campaigner at CCWA, is going to talk through what that protest and action looks like and what kind of support we're looking for on the day. So please, if you can, if you're in Perth and you can be there, stick around to be part of that discussion in the lead up. You can also volunteer with us through CCWA. You can subscribe to the nuclear newsletter that KA puts out every week, which has loads of information about what's happening in the nuclear industry nationally, globally, and in WA, and also has some really useful links about what's coming up and things that we're doing. If you're interested in nuclear power more generally, and you're also campaigning on climate and climate justice, we're holding a training session on nuclear power and climate change on the anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, the 26th of April, at the same time on a Tuesday, to help. We'll do some breakout sessions and chats to help skill people up to feel more confident to talk about nuclear power. The other thing that you can do is, and I know lots of people say it and some people roll their eyes, but writing letters is really valuable, and it's meaningful when politicians receive them. So you can visit your local member of parliament, write to the Minister for Environment and engage on this issue and say it's not good enough that we're this close to a uranium mine in WA under an anti-nuclear government, and remind them that there's this option now to withdraw 3 uranium mine approvals and secure those sites. You can also donate to our fighting fund, which helps us do lots of things, commission research. It helps us work more closely on country with traditional owners and support some of their efforts to come to the city to speak out or to get out on country to see the sites. And you can stay in touch with us on the VIMI resources issue after this webinar, and via email. We are really looking to ramp up the campaign on Mulga Rock specifically, and so please do stay in touch on Mulga Rock and all the things. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Mia. That's really great, really sharp and good. And there's great stuff going on in the chat, lots of links to resources and events and that sort of stuff. And as Mia said, there's a creative action that's being planned for next Wednesday, the 23rd of March. That's VIMI's annual meeting. And so after questions and a discussion, if people are keen to engage more in that or to hear more about that, then please stay on, and KA Garlick will lead us in a session that looks at what's planned and what's possible for that day on the 23rd. Mia, you sort of answered it, but there was a question in the chat. I want to go back just to that one, and that is, has VIMI put up a bond, and do they have to under WA law?
No, no and no. So no, they haven't posted a bond. And no, they don't have to. In WA, we under the Barnett government, they paid back over $1 billion in bonds when they did away with the bond system altogether, and they set up something called the Mining Rehabilitation Fund. So there's now every mining company that has done damage or made some mark on country has to pay a levy, an annual levy to the government, and this is representative of 1% of their total closure liability, an estimate of their costs of closure. So they pay this 1% levy into a fund. That fund is supposed to accumulate. They invest it, and interest raised from it goes into the fund, and that fund then goes towards rehabilitating WA's abandoned mines, and there's something like 80,000 abandoned mine features in WA, and then it's also supposed to be there in case any future company goes bust and leaves the mine site. So as of this year, the Mining Rehabilitation Fund has in it $216 million. So that's after about, it came in about 2015, so it's about six years later since it's been established, and it's 216 million. It grows annually by about 30 million. So if you think this mine operates for 15 years, by 2040, we would say that the fund might be something like 800 million. So one mine, Vimy Resources at Mulga Rock, after 15 years, we think that their liability would be around 500 million. It would take up most of the MRF. There's a lot of people that have problems with how the Mining Rehabilitation Fund works, and we think it's a big issue. In that whole process, the Minister for Mines still retains the power to apply a bond. So if at any time the Department of Mines thinks that there's an additional risk that this company is going to go bankrupt, the Minister can apply a bond. We're saying there is a risk. The risk is now. You should apply the bond from the get-go.
Okay, that seems a sensible and prudent approach there, Mia Pepper. Thanks for that. There's also a question from Tim. He's asking about the status of the fauna survey, or particularly the Sandhill Dunnett survey at Mulga Rock. Mia, is that one you can answer?
Yeah, so they have, one of the conditions on their environmental approval is that they have to have a Sandhill Dunnett management plan approved by the federal government and in consultation with Department of Biodiversity and Conservation here in WA. There was a draft of that. It hasn't been approved yet. And so part of why we were really concerned and we lodged complaints with the state and federal government was that they'd done, as part of their early works to prove substantial commencement, they did clearing in some prime Sandhill Dunnett habitat. And that's what we were really concerned about, was that they had gone and done that before they had this conservation plan approved. And it was also a variation to their environmental approval. So they had said that they wouldn't clear in that area where they were building their accommodation village, but they moved things around and then ended up clearing this really prime habitat that they hadn't first intended to mine. But it wasn't a breach of their conditions because they're allowed to clear, I can't remember off the top of my head, but they're allowed to clear a certain amount of sandhill donut habitat, and that was within their quota of how much they were allowed to destroy.
Okay, thanks. Carmen and Maria, I'd be interested to bring you in soon in a minute, but maybe Mia, while you're still going, there's one more from David Noonan asking about should federal Labor form government, Mulga Rock would require a federal Labor minister to give approval, and that could require further assessments and further opportunity to raise some of these things, including 100% bonds and the like. Have you got any comment about that, or is that something that's in your CCWA's thinking?
I don't recall if there is a federal condition on Mulga Rock for a bond. I know there was with Kintyre, because that was approved by a Labor federal minister. Mulga Rock was approved by a Liberal federal minister, and the conditions of federal conditions are shocking. They are like literally one page and very different. I'm not sure of any other ministerial approvals. I had thought that most of the approvals left at a federal level were departmental ones, but I can have another look at that. Always useful to look at.
Okay, thanks for that one, Mia. And Mia, when Mia had her slides up and was doing that presentation, there was one there like we track everything of the company, we track the company's positioning and what they do. And that's just one dot point, you know, it's 6 words. We track the company and keep an eye on what they're doing. But I just wanted to share with people on this call, like Mia does that enormously, like goes through company reports, goes through departmental reports, measures the discrepancies, raises them through Senate estimates with the Greens and with the support of Labor and crossbenchers and others, raises parliamentary questions in the federal and the WA Parliament, does on-ground visits, does a lot of technical work around the rehab, like what's actual possible and what's the cost, what's the complexity. So the level of detailed engagement work being done by Mia and CCWA is like, it's extraordinary. And it's so different to the sort of popular perception of environmentalism, which is, you know, stand outside and say no. Whereas Mia and the crew at CCWA stay inside, read the facts and know, and then they get out there and say no. So it's a very good combination. It's been very effective. There's a question that we'll take on notice, because there was a question that went to Maria Barton, and that was like, what sort of assistance would the Upurli Upurli Nguratja community want or would be useful? Maria's had to go to another event now, so she's just had to bail and said farewells. But we'll take that one on notice, and I know that KA and Mia and others are sitting down and talking, so that question will be paramount. It'll be really fleshed out and given some effect in the coming period. Carmen, I suppose just interested to hear your perception of these things, having been really close for a long time to politics. You would have seen times when there's particular political moments when circumstances converge. Do you see the situation now in the West, like a depressed uranium price, a high level of community resistance and concern, and an overwhelming, like a historically large state government mandate from a state government that has an anti-uranium position? Do you see this as one of those pivotal political moments?
I do, but I think, you know, in relation to the state government, we really need to, if I can put it bluntly, stick it up them, you know. they need to be reminded of the platform, and I know that Kaya and Mia have been doing that, and they need to, in a sense, grasp the urgency of this. And I think one of the things that is clearly going to play into this, and you referred to it earlier, Dave, is the anxiety, and I don't want to, you know, fuel it, but it's real, about what's happening in Ukraine. that, you know, the nuclear power plants there and our contribution to those power plants have become potent weapons in what is an extraordinarily violent, unjustified, you know, all of those descriptions that I'm sure have been preoccupying a great many people, that this is a moment that highlights just how dangerous this stuff is. And our role in it as Australians and Western Australians is one that can't be ignored. You know, it's enabled these power plants, and we can't be sure that it hasn't actually been used in nuclear weapons, despite a lot of assertions to the contrary. The international treaties and observations and monitoring just aren't good enough to really allow us to make that conclusion. So I think this moment where the vulnerability of nuclear plants has been so clearly highlighted is a moment for us to drive home the dangers associated with uranium mining, processing, exporting. You know, that we have a moral responsibility here. It's not just the effect that would have on us, and that's real enough, but you know, the effects that having on other people. And to push back against the argument, and I think this is important with governments, that somehow the dependence that Ukraine and the conflict there has exposed for the developed world in terms of their reliance on gas and oil is a moment for the nuclear industry to take off. You know, that this is the justification for further expansion of the nuclear power industry. I think we have to very clearly repudiate that argument and say, no, it's an argument for moving straight to renewables. You know, if you want energy security, you can't rely on things coming through pipes, and you can't rely on things that could turn into a kind of standing atomic bomb. So I do think that there are opportunities here. I mean, I don't mean to exploit people's pain, but to really understand the consequences of what's been exposed in Ukraine for us here as citizens and policymakers. And to just, the state government, I think, is sort of travelling along a bit complacently at the moment, you know, with that huge margin that they've got. I don't think, honestly, that they're using their political capital nearly as effectively as they might. You know, it's a dream. Any government that had that level of support could take the opportunity to make some really important decisions for the long term. They're not having to live from moment to moment. They actually can have a long view. And this is one of the very long views in the Labor Party history. So now's the time to act. And I think we'll all be pressing that message wherever we can. And I think it's important for people to press it with their local members, some of whom won't be around the next time around, it has to be said, but probably enough of them for them to retain government in the next term. So this is the time, as Mayor has said, to get those decisions done and dusted.
That's very clear assessment. I noticed that Giz Watson has asked the question, like how likely is it that WA Labor would legislate a ban on uranium mining? I imagine that you'll say it's more likely if we do more about it.
Yeah, look, legislating a ban, I don't know. I've never raised it in those terms exactly. So I guess we'd have to scope that out. But you can have an effective ban by you know, other means. I think a legislated ban is a good idea, honestly, but and given that they now, as Giz would know, have the luxury of control of both houses of Parliament, it's probably the first and only time in the history of Western Australia that Labor's had that, well, it is the only time it has had that opportunity. So it is an opportunity to ask, go to the max. Yeah, I don't disagree.
Okay, that's really good. I also wanted to pick up on one point that you said, Carmen. You were, you know, understandably and respectfully cautious of, you know, the claim of ambulance chasing. I think you said exploiting others' pain. And I fully get that, but I also think that it's not exploiting others' pain. It's taking some constructive action to reduce that pain, ensure it's not replicated elsewhere.
No, I agree. I agree with that. I just think we have to be careful how we construct the argument.
Absolutely, and you know, there will be plenty of people very quick to say that, you know, this is ambulance chasing and it's, you know, unkind and all that sort of stuff. But I think you know, what we've seen in Ukraine, what we're seeing daily now is just many people's worst case scenario being played out. You know, like a bunch of men who do not feel any sort of compulsion for a wide range of, value aligned stuff, seeking to use pretty much any means possible to advance a political agenda. And that means, including targeting nuclear facilities. It is a pretty profound wake-up call of the inherent risky nature of nuclear technology. The question, this might be to either of you really, but it was from Gita, and Gita wanted to know, like, who's listening, whose ears at a WA or federal government level are open. There might be some complexities about answering that, but I suppose the sense is there, maybe another way to look at that question is there an appetite for change and for doing things differently at a government level?
Mia, you go first.
We do have a lot of allies in state Labor. There are a lot of people, a lot of members of Parliament that we worked with really closely over the last decade and beyond, who agree with us and want to see change. And we're making a big effort now to reach out to those people who we've worked with over a long time, now that they're in power and in government, to do some of those things that we've asked. That is that to withdraw the approvals. We really had planned to campaign to legislate a ban, but with Mulga Rock the way it is, we feel that it's less likely with Mulga Rock in the background that Labor will do that, and so we're really keen to knock that off and then try again and refocus, because it is the long game. We don't want to be fighting this in 5 years or 2 years. We don't want to be fighting it now. We definitely don't want to be fighting it in 10 years. And yeah, the way the balance of power is in this state, we have an opportunity now that we might not get again to knock this industry off. And there are allies in WA Labor that are helping drive that. Federal Labor, not so much. Federal Labor are concerned about nuclear weapons, and they're concerned about nuclear power. We wish a lot that people in Labor were more empowered and vocal about nuclear submarines, and hope that they find the courage to do that, because it's really important. And the state and federal Liberal governments, as you know, are there's no one's home on this, and state and federal Greens have always been, fantastic allies and supporters, and do what they can when they can, depending on their numbers, and heaps of other issues that they're trying to tackle with few people in Parliament. But this is a bread and butter issue. So all of those political allies are really key. We've got union faith groups. We work closely with First Nations communities affected, and there's strong state and national alliances. So I hope that answers the question about our allies and who's listening and who's with us.
Yeah, I think it does very well.
Yes. Thanks, Mia. I just to say one thing. I mean, it's great, the relationship you have with the members of Parliament, but it's probably a good thing if some of them would be a bit more public about it, especially because it's in the platform, so they're not straying from the party line. It's clear what if you like, both the intention and the letter of the law mean, the letter of the platform mean. And one of the things that we did, and Giz might vaguely remember this, which didn't unfortunately go very far, but it's a vehicle that's worth thinking about, is we formed a group called initially Parliamentarians Against Uranium Mining, and then subsequently Parliamentarians for a Nuclear-Free Future. And I think there's probably some room for a group such as that to form in Western Australia at the very least, and maybe further. And some of those members of parliament who as I say, I think will be one term, because they are in, the Republic of Netherlands. Give us a break, it's without singling that member out, that's very unlikely that that person will continue. So having a task and a series of objectives that are entirely consistent with the party's history and philosophy and platform and driving it would be a good idea. I mean, I've been surprised at how little comment there's been about the nuclear-powered submarines apparently now going to be stationed just outside the Perth metropolitan area. Excuse me? This is, and it's taken as given that this is a completely safe thing to do.
Yeah, indeed. And over on the East Coast, very much the same thing with this announcement this week, 3 potential sites. And there is strong community and trade union concern and resistance, but not a strong Labor position. And obviously that's really that federal Labor don't feel that national security interests serve them in an election context, and they're trying to avoid the khaki election being hammered by the Murdoch press, which is all real world understandable, but also it doesn't change the real world to make it safer and a kinder place to be. I think that's a really good idea, the parliamentary friendship group idea, and I reckon that sense of like, I suppose, encouraging Labor to be the best version of themselves and expecting that they will deliver on what's a long-standing policy. That's they're really good suggestions. It's also really good to remember here, folks, that we're talking about a fight that's gone on for a long time. 4 uranium mines, 3 are now, well, 4 uranium projects, 3 are now stalled. They're just stalled, and 1 is not viable. Like it's going ahead, it's shaking the can, it's trying to raise money, but it has said itself that its project model is not economically viable. So there's lots of hurdles here, social license and cost in particular, and lots of opportunities to take it further here. Mia, just a question for you is have you seen any change over time in how business journos and media talk about uranium? Have you seen a bit more of a ground truth approach, or does it still get that sort of get out of jail free, it's going to be booming next week coverage?
I'm not sure if I guess it's kind of come full circle. There's a lot more optimism about uranium price recovering. There was, some big things that happened late last year with the Sprott Foundation buying up, I can't remember now off the top of my head, $200 million worth of uranium, which took out a lot of the oversupply, the inventories of uranium, and the uranium price shot up. I think the uranium price off the back of what's happened in Ukraine has been really interesting to watch. As one of the reactors was being shelled and being taken opposition, stock prices fell as an initial response, and then rebounded really, really strongly after that, noting that this conflict might dry up supply. And it's just kind of, for me, somebody that doesn't really, live in the finance world and invest money, I feel like it's just actually so obscene that people look at the conflict and where they can make $1 and start investing in uranium because Russia's now threatening the security supply. And, it's the same with oil and other fossil fuels. And it's disgusting, and I think shows some really horrific ways that our markets work. Sorry, I think I got distracted and riled up for a second. But the business journalists and how they report on it, they're skeptical. I think at the end of the day, most journalists that have watched uranium over the last 10 years are still a little bit skeptical.
Yeah. Okay, no, that's good.
What do you think, Dave?
I'm routinely amazed at what a free kick the industry gets and how it fails to deliver on a whole range of criteria, and it still is able to reinvent itself, admittedly in a pretty value fixed media, but it's able to reinvent itself as just about to boom. just about to come around the corner and save us. And that concerns me. It concerns me in a time where we're dealing with the twin threats of nuclear risk and unchecked climate change, that the industry is seeking to present itself as a credible response to climate, when at the best it's a profoundly damaging distraction. That's what I think. I think they've got much better marketers than they do machinery. They're good spin, but not much substance. But I also take a lot of pleasure or comfort from the growth of renewables and the market penetration of renewables, and just how much more efficient and effective and competitive that technology is. Because I think for me, Ukraine absolutely shows that if you are designing an energy system, and if you want energy security, energy independence, resilience, without having vulnerabilities built in, you would absolutely not. The last choice you'd make is nuclear. You would go renewable.
Dave, just to make an additional point there, I mean, I think one of the things that's changed is that the renewables industry is big enough and now better organised, so that when some of those more extravagant and bizarre claims are made by the nuclear industry, they're pushing back. They're not accepting it. They're basically making the point that you've just made and refusing to accept that this is actually a solution at all, and that they have, in a sense, they can point to the price and environmental and every other benefit that goes with renewables. Excuse me.
No, absolutely, Carmen. And I think what we're looking at here is a bit of a T-junction, like there's an energy T-junction or Y-junction. We're coming to some form of fork in the road where we're either going to go down an increasingly centralised and dirty system, more of the same, or fundamentally switch to renewables. And I think that's the big energy challenge. And one of the big energy challenges for environmentalists is, as we promote renewables, which we do and which we should, we need to get a little bit more sophisticated about ensuring that they're responsibly sourced and sourced with a good process, a good practice, with community benefit, with Indigenous consent, all of those criteria, which so often aren't happening in the current expression of the Australian mining sector.
Yeah.
There are not a lot of other questions in the chat or the Q&A rather, and thanks for folks for doing the Q&A. So if that's the case, we've got a bit of time. Unless there's a sort of flurry of, you know, last minute questions, what I'd propose to do or like to do is give Carmen and Mia an opportunity to just have a final reflection, and then if that works, maybe we look to go into that session with KA for those who can and who have want to have a discussion around that the creative action on the 23rd of March. So if you have got any questions, do chuck them in chat or Q&A. I think, yeah, and otherwise, what I'll do is just invite, there's some questions here that I'm not quite sure, like there's some observations, and it refers to that the Mulga Rock approval process under Labor government, which I think Mia has answered pretty comprehensively before. So there might be opportunities there that'll be explored. But yeah, so do pop in a question if you've got one. Otherwise, I'd ask, might start with you, Mia, if that's okay. If you've got any sort of final observations on the campaign, the time we're in, or particular ways forward that you'd like to share with crew.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I guess, yeah, there's been a lot of blows and a lot of opportunity for the WA uranium campaign over the last few months, with the expiry of the approvals and the substantial commencement issues at Mulga Rock, and there's a lot of moving pieces and a lot has changed. And I think underneath it all, there is this sense of huge disappointment that Mulga Rock got over the line, and that's changed our opportunities to campaign for that legislative ban. And I think what's been really disheartening as well, that we've discovered or started to really understand how bad our Native Title Act is and how bad native title rights are, that this company got a mining lease in 2016, and actually, though there's expectations that they would meet with Upurli Upurli, they don't have a legal requirement to, and they're not. And the reality that brings home, I think, for us and for Maria and some of the other women that are campaigning against the mine at Mulga Rock through their native title group, has been really disparaging and really confronting, and just really brings home how far we have to go in campaigning for change, not just on uranium mining, but on mining in general and on land rights, that we don't have land rights, that native title is not land rights and we don't have it, and that people are cut out of and completely cut out of government processes to make decisions about what happens on their country is, it's hard and it's shameful. And I hope that we see change on that very, very soon, and encourage everyone to campaign on that in any form that they can, because that is underneath all of this, is that traditional owners in this country don't have rights to make decisions about their own country, and that's shameful. And
yeah, well said. Like people say that if you can't say no, then you've never really said yes. And I think people are very often shocked when they realise that the native title system gives applicants a seat at the table, but no right to say no to what's on the table. So yeah, it's a very, very cruel and stacked deck, which again is just a further tribute to the resilience of people and to the resilience of all the Wampa mob who have, done literally long, hard kilometres on dusty tracks, keeping the door shut. Carmen, would you have any thoughts or insights you'd like to share?
Look, just briefly, I mean, I really endorse what Mia is saying, and unfortunately in Western Australia, the revised new Act on protection of Aboriginal cultural heritage isn't going to fill the gap either, if there are threats to particular sites. So there's a whole stack of work that needs to be done there. And certainly in CCWA, we're very keen to collaborate with local communities protecting their places, and to try and find better ways of communicating with government about that, rather than it's a very formal approach at the moment. And that's the other thing I think that's worth noting here, is that the approval in the case of Vimy Resources Mulga Rock was given by a government department which I think has been, like many of the others, so immersed in the idea that mining is the only thing that this state can do, and they must always facilitate mining, that they often fail to examine the merits of particular proposals. So I think there's some work to be done with our public service, frankly, and that means, a political and policy decision. But across Australia, we've seen a de-skilling of the public service, state and federal. A whole lot of work goes out to consultants in many cases who, do as much as they're paid for. And that within our public service now, there are very few people, I think, who really care beyond the immediate ticker box. And I'm not quite sure how we get over that, but it's something that's troubled me for a while. And I think bringing public service into some of our discussions, okay, they can't be political, but they are being political by, in a sense, failing to examine some of these long-term trends. I mean, what they're there for is to give advice to government about what should be done in the interests, in this case, of Indigenous people, the long-term health of the community, the moral stance that Australian government should have in the international community. And I think what they're doing a lot of the time is just yes ministering, so that the politicians of the day don't get the nudge that they often need to think a little differently. You know, how about this or that or some other way of looking at it? And I was very disappointed in this case because I know Mia had worked pretty hard with some of the people involved in making that decision to draw to their attention the very real costs of doing what they subsequently did. But I think they're timid. They are, you know, mining is a mining state, and you do what the mining industry wants. And we've really got to change that. So attacking that close relationship between government and the mining sector is one of the things I think that will change all of this. And part of our activism has to be to expose and unpick that.
That's great. That's really thoughtful and great. And it fits in, like, you know, there's been talk recently about, you know, on a federal government level, how the bill for consultancy has gone through the roof as you get in gun for hire to do the job. And you move from a concept where you were saying of like service for the public in the common good to industry facilitation. And yeah, I think that's a very important point indeed, because like, it's like, you know, one of the things like a good media, it's like and vibrant civil society, these things are the you know, plasma and the blood of democracy. That's really thoughtful stuff from our speakers tonight. I can't see a lot more burning questions, so I reckon there might be people keen to talk about this actual one specific event, being the 23rd of March action at BIMI's annual meeting. So I suppose what I will do now is just thank very sincerely Carmen and Mia and Maria for really thoughtful presentations, and more importantly for the body of work that you and so many others in the West have done, which has brought us to this point. To be here after a decade of the Barnett government and there's no uranium being dug up in Western Australia is a massive tribute to people power and community resistance. It really is. So congratulations to you. Congratulations to the crew in the West. And thanks so much to everybody for joining us tonight. This is an exciting time in the West. And like Carmen said, it is a time where there is a time of choice. Like, we can choose to sort of exert our rights as citizens, and that will challenge this concept of us as clients and consumers, because we're citizens. We've got to demand and expect better. Someone's asked, will the recording be available for others to watch? I'm absolutely sure it will. I imagine it will be linked to the CON's website in some way. I think that'll be the norm. But yeah, do talk it up, because there's some wise words in this one. And it is an exciting time, because we really are on the cusp of potentially swinging things around quite significantly. So yeah, as GT has just said, take heart, everyone. I think so.